Go back. Next project I'm going to work on is a new desk for my office. The desk is going to be part of a larger setup, which will include shelves and a number of other features that you saw there. But this is stage one, going to build a new desktop to replace my current desktop, and then the rest will come later. First step that I want to take here is to build the form. I'm going to be pouring epoxy in between a couple of slabs for the desktop, and going to need a form to do that. Because of the small shop space that I have, I need to get that form built and then get it out of the shop, out of the way, so that I can prepare the slabs and not have to worry about having both and filling space after. I also want to finish the slab work as close to when I'm going to pour the epoxy as possible. So having that form ready will just make that real easy. The material I like to use for building forms is the particle board, although it really sucks to work with because it creates just so much really bad dust. It really is the best thing. Maintains a bit of flexibility, which is nice for pulling the forms apart when you're done, and just really easy to work with and get nice clean forms. So cutting that down here, you saw the big piece in the first cut there, which is the base, and then I'll cut a number of pieces for the sides of the mold. With the particle board, definitely need something so that the epoxy doesn't stick, and I'm a fan of the tuck tape, sheathing tape. It works real well. Nothing really sticks to it, and even without a mold release, you're pretty much safe with the sheathing tape. But I will put a mold release on as well, just to make sure that I've got no stick at all. Really comes apart easily. With all of the pieces cut and taped, I can come back and drill out the screw holes. I've really found after a couple of molds that I've built, the best way to do this is to drill them out and not worry about countersinking and using a conical head, really just switching 100% to the button head screws. You can see here putting them in. I just find without having to worry about that countersink, you really don't have to worry about damaging the edges of the form. The button heads tighten up real nice and then don't really damage the edges. And with the particle board, it's so easy to do that. Once I've got the form assembled, I can move it out of the shop and start work on the prep of the slabs. Of course, first thing up is to remove all the bark, and so coming through with a chisel, knock all that bark away, peel it all off, and then come through with the chisel again and scrape away the majority of that cambium layer. Always satisfying when you can get a big chunk out like that. This one slab had quite a knot. The other slab had a couple of smaller ones as well. This one was quite big, maybe 2 inches long, inch and a half wide, and all that is just rotted material that really wouldn't survive um, through the epoxy. So I'll peel all that out with the chisel and then come back with a fine tuning uh, to just get a real clean surface. That'll actually end up being a key focal point of this piece. With all the rough work done, come back in with the nylon wire wheel. Again, I really prefer these to the metal wire wheels. They just leave a much better surface, a much cleaner surface after you're done. And that just really gets rid of all that last bit of material, all the last bit of cambium and whatnot that you don't want to leave on there. So you get a good epoxy joint. The prep work on the slabs is quite a number of hours. I think it was 2 or 3 hours just to go through and remove all the bark, remove all the cambium, clean up those edges, peel out any of the knots that needed to be peeled out. Um, you can see here just a lot of tedious work going back, making sure you get every last little bit so that the final surface you have is nice and clean to get a good epoxy joint. Once all that work is done, come back and now can start milling up the slabs. So first thing, cut them to length. Knowing that I'm going to use the entire width of the slab, cutting to length first here ensures that I keep the maximum amount of material for the offcuts, and I use all my offcuts. I will find something, whether it's on this project or the next, to make use of these offcuts. And so cutting them away, keeping them at max length is always valuable. You saw in the last video some of the end bits I was able to make use of the new track saw. Of course, this was done prior to having the track saw, and so doing it the old-fashioned way, straight edge guide, and a couple of runs with the circular saw. These slabs are, at this point, about 8 1/4, 2 inches for those not familiar, and so quite a cut to make with one pass. It's just better to make it in 2 passes. With the slabs cut to length, I can get them on the flattening table. This is my first flattening table, and come through, and I'll really just flatten one side. All I want to do here is get the slabs down to one flat surface. When I've got one flat surface, they'll sit in the mold, and then I want to leave as much material for after as possible. And so just flatten the one side of each of the slabs so they'll sit in the mold nicely. With one side flattened and both slabs cut to length, I'll come through and slice the second slab in half. So effectively, I'm going to have 3 pieces of wood and 2 sort of gaps filled with epoxy, and that'll give me a wood edge on both the front and the back of the desk, which I think will be a really nice touch, and also prefer to have that wood at the edge rather than the epoxy. Just find I like the look better, and from a durability perspective, would rather be against that wood edge than epoxy. So marked up the slab with where I want to make the cut. You can see I used the big triangle and the long level to get a nice straight line, and then set in a flat edge. Don't like using the level for this. Got a little bit of flex in the level, so using a nice thick piece of wood, give a nice straight edge. I can come through and cut away the half. Again, I'll use both pieces, so it'll all end up in the desk in the end, just in a different orientation. Once I've got everything cut to size or close to it, I'll come back through and lay everything in the mold and really make sure that I've got the orientation that I want. I'm not showing it here, but I did have a number of runs I did where I had to just keep trimming those edges a little bit, take a millimeter, and just get them to fit in as tight as possible. In between there, went through and caulked the slab, and then once all that caulking is cured, come through with a mold release. This spray on is a real nice, easy product to work with. Had great success with it. Really easy to use. You just got to make sure that you don't have any of the wood anywhere near it when you're spraying it on. You don't want to get any overspray on the edges of the wood, otherwise nothing will stick to it. That's kind of the whole point of the mold release. So make sure that the slabs are out of the way when you spraying that on. One last thing before I finally set the slabs into the mold, come back through and just putting a little 1/8 of an inch chamfer on the edges of the slabs. That's just going to let them sit in the mold without damaging the caulking around the edges. If you didn't take that off, that sharp corner is not going to want to sit in the mold because of the caulking. The caulking doesn't sit perfectly into a 90-degree, and so just taking that little bit off will give you a nice tight fit and make sure everything sits down flat against the bottom of the mold. That way you're not getting a whole pile of epoxy wasted just floating under the mold. It's all going to go where you want it. You'll see after when I start to flatten these that was pretty significant. Really didn't get any epoxy under, and that's what you want. If you're in a small shop like I am, every bit counts, and any epoxy that you're wasting is just money you're wasting. So really want to get as good of a pour as possible. With the slabs set in place and where I want them to be, come back with a couple of blocks, again with duct tape on them. I don't bother to spray these with the mold release, just the duct tape again will be pretty good on its own. These will hold the slabs down in place so they don't float up when the epoxy's poured. I didn't have all the wood at the same thickness, so the middle slab is taller than the 2 pieces that were from the single slab before that now make the outsides. And so I had to put a little spacer block in and end up with the crossbars at a bit of an angle to hold everything in. With that all in place, come back through, marked out every 6 inches and measured at each of those points and wrote down the gap, and I'll use this to measure out how much epoxy I need. Measuring those gaps and then adding up the sections, you can figure out how much you need without too much extra. I probably mixed up more than I needed to on this project, to be honest, but as I'll show in a future project, lots of ways that you can use that up. Because you're going to have one side of the slab facing down and therefore not exposed to air, to avoid any warping of the slab as it's sitting in the mold, come back through. I like to use just a little brush on lacquer, brush that on the top, and that just seals it up a little bit so that you're getting, a similar condition on both sides, really not getting that exposure to oxygen. And with that, the slab's ready to start pouring epoxy. You can see here, I'm pouring a thin layer of a pretty heavily black tinted epoxy, and so really just wanting to create an effectively opaque condition at the bottom. I like the black look, but I really want to also keep the live edges visible so that when you're looking at the slab, you can sort of see down into it, but not all the way through it necessarily. The condition in the end, the black wasn't completely opaque. There was just a slight bit of transparency, but it's dark enough that unless you're looking up close, you really can't see through. And so for me, it turned out real well. So I'm pouring about 1/4 of an inch. And while I'm making these pours, you got to be really careful. Don't want to get any of that dyed epoxy anywhere but where you want it to sit. So really trying to make sure that I'm pouring directly onto the surface of the mold and not onto the edges of the wood. And that way I don't get any of that black residue left on the edges. I get a nice clean edge. With the epoxy poured in place, come back using a little butane torch here and just popping all those bubbles. Try to move real quickly through that because I really don't want to get too much exposure from the torch to the epoxy. You can cause some effectively damage to the epoxy, flash curing, and that's going to leave you with a condition you don't really want in the end. And I actually got a bit of that. One of the mistakes I made on this project was I torched one section when it was already too close to being, at its sort of firm or partially cured state, and it did bubble up a little bit. And you can sort of see that through the clear epoxy, which is not ideal. Nevertheless, it turned out okay. So mixed up my clear using a deep pour for this so that I really get all those bubbles out. You can see there it touched the surface. So I did this first layer with just a regular tabletop epoxy to sort of quickly cure, and then sort of came back straight away, a couple hours later. And you can see when I touched the epoxy surface, it left a fingerprint, but it didn't dent. And that's effectively, the perfect time. You're going to get a chemical bond between the two layers of epoxy, which is what you really want, better than having a mechanical bond by sanding that layer. So really the perfect time to pour. So come back through here now with the clear epoxy, start filling in all the gaps. For those attentive, you probably heard my dog barking in the background. She clearly was unhappy that I was pouring epoxy and not playing with her. Although I'm not completely submerging the slabs in epoxy, I did pour it into the bigger knot holes that I'd emptied out while I was prepping the slabs, just to make sure that I fill as much as possible. I really don't want to have to spend any time or as little as I can coming back and doing rework and refills later. And then come through with a brush and brush along the edges just to make sure that there's no bubbles and get a nice bond between the epoxy and the wood. And then same thing again, come back and torch away all those bubbles. After at least a week of curing time, and in my case, because this is a hobby that I do on the side, it was really 2 or 3 weeks before I was able to get back to this. Can pull all the blocks in the form away, so taking the blocks off, the crosses off. You can see there just a little bang with the side of the hand, and those blocks pop right off with no mold release, and that's the joy of the sheathing tape. If you don't want to use your hand, a little tap with a mallet and pops right out. No big deal. You can take the mold apart, and once you've got the screws out, you'll see what I was mentioning earlier. With the particle board being quite flexible, it really does allow you to just sort of pull gently or tap gently on one side and sort of peel it away. And again, that's also the value of the mold release. Having that mold release on there really ensures that you don't get a bond at all between the sheathing tape and the epoxy. And so just a little bit to break the seal, you can see, and then the whole thing just pops right off. No effort at all. Real simple. So pop all 4 sides of that mold off, put them away. I save all my molds. Anything that I'm building, I'll use them again, I hope. Future projects. Worst case scenario, I'm using it for something smaller, but can still reuse the exact same pieces and just cut them down and retape them. So I'll save these all. They go in a storage room for later. Didn't have any good wedges, and to be honest, I probably need to cut them, but I just haven't got around to it. So using a little spackling knife here to separate the mold from the top. In this case, the majority of what I've got is being got to deal with is being the caulking. So splitting that caulking away, separating that, and then it's really just having that mold sort of in a way hydrolocked, if you want to think of it that way. Like you get it basically a seal between the mold and the surface, and it's not so much that the epoxy is stuck to it. It just, you know, it's tight. But a little bit of time with that spackling knife to just sort of break the corners and break the edges, and the slab will pop right out. Stay tuned for the next video to see the back half. Here's a little preview of what's to come. Gotta flatten this slab up and sand it all down. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.